You want this adjusted a little higher? Let's go back. Okay. Yeah, I did tell in Sabbath school, Lauren, the story. Since he spilled the beans, I was going to spring that later, but one of the people involved in the story was Francis Miller, which is my maternal grandmother's twin brother. And he was a missionary in Japan prior. Yeah, I think I can hear myself through it. He was a missionary in Japan, and he had the ability to read and write Japanese, along with one of his colleagues. So at the start of World War II, he left Japan and came back to the States. And this is just one aspect of the story of when he was returning back to Japan. So just to give you a quick background, as you all know, back on December 7, 1941, the sovereign nation of Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and led to the U.S. entry into World War II. Now, once that happened, then the church in Japan, the Seventh Adventist Church, all Christian churches, faced dilemma. And then for one thing led to another, and at the end, the U.S. dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki of the sovereign nation of Japan, ending World War II. I know that's kind of a lazy, there's a lot of history in between, one thing led to another, but that's not really part of the story. This is just what was happening in the background. Just to give you a background, Guam is a small island out in the Pacific, and you can see, get rid of that, where it's located just above Australia and just off of China. And it was a U.S. territory in the start of World War II, and was captured by Japan, and then it was liberated 10 August of 1944. So now the Guam was actually a halfway point for the U.S. military. So they used the ports, and they used it as a refueling stop. Oh, come on. Well,
so Japan had taken Guam over?
Japan had taken Guam over, and it was a problem. Now, again, I also point out that the capture and the liberation of Guam isn't part of the story either, but it's just part of the background. Yeah, Guam was taken over, and the natives were very, very happy to have the U.S. liberate Guam in 1944, because the Japanese did not treat the Churro people very well. But I do point out that after the liberation of Guam, the U.S. Navy started to use it as a staging base. Now, this is where the story starts that I'm telling. And that is, as a result of that time, Seventh-day Adventist military crew members now had access to Guam because they were part of the fleet. It's also at this time that A.N. Nelson and F.R. Millard, being engaged in language work by the United States government, were assigned interpreters to accompany a special mission to Japan. Now, all of this information I'm presenting is actually directly out of the Review and Herald. So in 1946, when the article was written, the Review and Herald, of course, had no idea what the special mission was. They just knew that Nelson and Millard were on their way to Japan for special interpretation message. Well, it turns out in recently, and I mean very recently, declassified documents, they were actually on the way for the war crime tribunals. So I know that one person that Francis Millard interpreted for or interviewed was the Secretary of Finance, the Japanese Secretary of Finance. And that turns out he didn't commit any war crimes. He was just a very conscientious Japanese official. So they didn't actually use any of the data in the war crime tribunal. But that's what he was doing. That's what both him and Nelson were doing. Now, Henry Metzler was a pharmacist mate, first class, and he had landed on Guam shortly after liberation. And of course, the first thing he did is initiate contact to look up any Seventh-day Adventists who might be on the island. At that time, there were no Seventh-day Adventists on the island except for other crewmates that were Seventh-day Adventists. So as he was out canvassing the island looking for Seventh-day Adventists, he met Mr. and Mrs. Ulalo and their children. Now these were, I believe, Baptists. They were very sincere Christians. I believe they're Baptists. Baptists had a very strong presence on Guam at that time. And through the efforts of Brother Metzger, they were led to accept this new light of the Sabbath and the Christianity. So then, other Adventist soldiers arrived, and they formed a formal meeting with the Ulalos at the Ulalo house. And the Adventist soldiers did a thorough job working on instructing these new converts. And they soon were ready for baptism. Unfortunately, even though this at the time period, this was in, I believe, August of 1945, and the Japanese surrender. No, this was in late September, and the Japanese surrender actually took place September 6th, but there was still a war going on. They weren't able just to flip a switch and say, okay, now we're not at war anymore. So they were still at war, which meant travel was still very restricted. So the only military people had access to come into and out of Guam at that time. So they wanted to have somebody come into Guam to baptize this family that was ready, but it wasn't going to happen because the travel was restricted. So they did put out a call. They had a Filipino pastor that were available and trained, and they put out a call to get one to go in, but of course it was still restricted. And so they couldn't be helped for some time, and they didn't know how long it would be. And that's cue when Nelson and Francis Millard were on a special mission to Japan. So they were hoping, as they flew out of Honolulu, Hawaii, and they had to do a fuel stop in Guam, and they were hoping that they'd have some time to go meet with the Ulalo family and potentially baptize them. However, in Honolulu, at the time, they were told, no, that's not going to happen. We're going to land in Guam, refuel, and take off. You won't have any time. You won't even be able to get off the plane. But this is an excerpt from the Review and Herald article. As it pointed out, God was evidently working out an answer to Brother Metzger's prayers. So as soon as we got off the plane, they were informed all flights to Tokyo were canceled because of bad weather. So as soon as they were assigned quarters on Guam's, they got in touch with Robert Beckett, which was another Seventh-day Adventist sailor, and went to meet with the Ulalos. They traveled to the Ulalo family and counted among and the Ulalo family here is just an aside. They were leading citizens of Guam. They were some of the more wealthy people on Guam. Now, the thing I want to point out here is not only did God intervene and stop the plane in Guam for significantly longer than a couple hours for refueling, all expenses were paid because Nelson and Millard they were special interpreters for the U.S. Army, the 6th Battalion, bombing battalion, And as such, they were pretty much treated as officers. All their meals were paid for, and as you saw here, they were assigned quarters. They didn't even have to go find a place to stay. The army took care of everything. So and so that was the church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and the Elder Miller and Elder Nelson didn't have to ante up any money. It was all taken care of. So then, on the Sabbath afternoon, on their layover, the 9 members of the Olalo family gathered on coral sand of Tumon Bay for a baptismal service. They baptized were father, mother, 6 of their children, and a nephew who lived in their home. All the family was baptized as Seventh-day Adventist. And they also pointed out that James Chisholm, a pharmacist's mate second class, also took his stand and converted as a Seventh-day Adventist. So the layover of Elder Nelson and Elder Miller lasted for actually 5 days. They were on the island for 5 days. So they were able to teach and work with the people and the Olalo family. So I just wanted to point out that the purpose of the story is out of the tragedy of war come many indications of God's providential care. As we left Guam, it was with profound, this is Elder Miller writing, it was a profound conviction that God overrules in the affairs of men. For a number of years, they had tried to get somebody to Guam to preach the Seventh-day Adventist message and the Sabbath message, and they hadn't been able to do it. But now, as a result of war, and a group of conscientious Adventist men were placed there. So what I want to point it out here, and that's the basis of my title. War is war, but God is God, and God is always in control, and He can use the chaos of war to get the message to people who need to hear it. This is an interesting side note, and they threw it out there. Brother Metzger's departure from the island was unexplainedly delayed, so he could witness the baptism. He was scheduled to be shipped out for some reason. They didn't say why. It got delayed. Well, we all know why it was delayed, because God wanted him to see the fruits of His work. So I just want things we can learn. Even in a time of war, God and the inherent evils, God is active. God does watch over all of His church at all times. That's important. And never tell Lauren an interesting story. You're going to have to come to Vespers. Let's see what else. So one of the other parts of this that's interesting. That'll be part if you want to hear further stories. There's more stories of when Nelson and Miller get to Japan. There's a lot of interesting stories there. But one part of the story was in the bombing of Hiroshima, there were Seventh-day Adventists. There was a Seventh-day Adventist church in Hiroshima. Now, in August of 1945, the Japanese government forced the Seventh-day Adventist church out of existence and forced them to dismantle the Seventh-day Adventist church building. They had to tear it down. As a result, all the Seventh-day Adventists dispersed out of Hiroshima, save for 20 people. And when the bomb hit, of these 20 people, many of whom were a kilometer from the epicenter. Now, I don't know if you know a lot about a nuclear bomb, especially, I think this was a little boy. It was like 400-ton TNT. It was a very powerful bomb, but its destruction radius was about 2 kilometers. So, but they were Adventists in Hiroshima that were about 1 kilometer from the epicenter. Not a single one of them was hurt or killed. So, now, I don't know if some of you older people remember Paul Harvey. I grew up listening to Paul Harvey. My grandparents loved Paul Harvey, and he had the radio show, and he always told these interesting stories, but he always, after the commercial break, came back and said, and now for the rest of the story. So I have the rest of the story. After the Francis Millard and Andrew Nelson continued on to Japan, for 2 years, Mrs. Ulalo regularly sent word to the Pacific Conference. She was the treasurer of the little company, the little family, and that met in their house and had church services. And she regularly remitted her tithes and mission offerings to the division treasurer in Manila and later Singapore. For some months, the only report of offerings received for the whole of the Far Eastern Division was from this little isolated island of Guam. So that is just amazing to me. And then due to the, as I mentioned, due to the travel restrictions, because it was still war, and then even after war, there was a lot of mopping up, and it wasn't. It was a lot more difficult for the Allies to clean up the Japanese theater than the European theater. Once the Germans surrendered, that was pretty much, a couple months they were done. It took until 1972 for the last Japanese soldier to surrender. So it took them a while to mop up all the pockets of resistance. So the travel restriction was pretty tight. And it wasn't until September 1947 that they sent help to Guam. This was Pastor Bautista. Now that's another interesting story that would be interesting, because Pastor Bautista was a Philippine pastor, and he was doing a mission in one of the islands, the Indonesian islands, and was the sole person that was on that island canvassing for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And once in 1947, once the travel restrictions, he was available, so they sent him to Guam. And he tells of some of the stories of the church that was present on Guam 2 years after the Millard and Nelson were there. He talks about a man that he met that had left the Catholic Church in 1922 because his study of the Bible led him to believe that the Catholic Church was not following the Bible. Then, when he arrived on prior to World War II, he was on Guam, and as the only active denomination on Guam at that time were the Baptists. So he joined the Baptists. He became a Baptist, but he actually spent, I can't remember. It was 25 years. For 25 years, he kept the Sabbath holy, and he kept Sunday for the Baptist holy, and he paid tithe to the Baptist Church. And I point out in the article, they said it was purely by accident, and this is my addition, if one can call the intervention of Providence an accident, that just at this time, he heard of the Seventh-day Adventist, and he accepted the message. Another story, another man was a police guard in the village where the Ulalo lived. And as the Ulalos were part of the Baptist church, they were very good friends. And when the Ulalos converted to Seventh-day Adventism, they remained friends. Well, she continued to work on him. You see here, she gave him a copy of the Signs of the Time. And she met him and asked him what he thought of it. And he replied, he read in the paper the article, and from now on you can count me as a Sabbath keeper. So he read the Signs of the Time, and he converted at that time. So I did look up the current state of the SDA Church in Guam. It's been very active. The first official Adventist church was organized May 29, 1948 at Diedo. There was an SDA clinic that's still there. I looked up on Google Maps. It's still there. And it's actually grown quite big. There's actually a college on Guam, an SDA college on Guam that's active. And at the current, as of 2024, the data I had, there's 38 churches and 5,500 members across the island of Guam.
What's the population?
I don't really know. It's a couple million. It's not huge. I don't know. I could look it up. So now, to finish the story, the founders of the church in just at the end of World War II were, of course, these two sailors that were allowed on the island as a result of the war and the staging. They were instrumental in establishing the church. And arriving in 1945, Beckett and other Adventists held their first Sabbath service in a military tent hospital. I did read, I have access, it's a very interesting read. There was a Japanese pastor that was baptized in 1961 and came to the United States to do his doctoral work at Andrews University. And there's a copy of his doctoral thesis that was available. And of course, it's a history of the Seventh Adventist Church in Japan from the inception. The Seventh Adventist Church started in Japan in 1912 through World War II, and then after World War II and to the present. I've only got, it's 700 pages, so I've only gotten through the first 200 pages, but I got through the part I wanted, which was the part about when Francis Millard actually, when he got back to Japan, pre-Japan, he was the principal of the boys' school. When he got back, they made him the head of the Japanese church, the conference in Japan. And for the next 10 years, he led the church through the Reconstruction. Let's see. And then, of course, in October 1945, Andrew Nelson and Francis Miller baptized 9 members of the Alalu family in Tumon Bay, forming the first congregation. And all of that took place because of unexpected storms over Tokyo that delayed the flight for 5 days. So I'm going to point out, this is where I came up with. I was trying to figure out what title, and this is the basis of my title. The Axis conducted a war that we know can only be attributed to Satan. The concentration camps, the Unit 741 from Japan, the Japanese concentration camps, all of that was such a horrendous evil. Even non-Christians were just aghast at how bad the Axis powers were. So, but even so, God is still in control. People that would have had no contact with the message gained there because would have had no contact with the message gained access because there was godly men ready and able when needed. And that's another aspect too. A lot of congregations forbid their people, their conscientious objectors, and they won't serve. And according to this dissertation, he looked into that. And the Adventist Church has always been there's no prohibition against serving in the military by Seventh Adventists. The preference is they serve as a medical capacity, and they support the mission that way. So we have people like Desmond Doss, and we have people like Metzer, who are pharmacist mates, which is equivalent to a physician assistant nowadays. And because of that, these people are available in places where they wouldn't normally be a Seventh-day Adventist present to preach the Word. So I think it's not a bad stance from our church. And I just want to point out, I think God did have a productive week. So are there any questions? I'll try to answer what I can. I mean, I had a lot of information that I didn't present here. Just, yeah.
Do you know anything about Micronesia or the other U.S. territories in that area and the Adventist presence during the war or after or before?
No, I didn't. Well, see,
Marshall Islands?
yeah, a lot of my focus here, of course, was on Francis Millard, my great uncle. So I pretty much concentrated on Japan. I know that there are other stories. I know there's the Seventh-day Adventist Church had a presence in the Philippines. I know that there's interesting stories about Pastor Batista. He was very prominent in a lot of the articles I was reading, both for the Indonesia area and for Guam and for the Philippines. So that would be an interesting one too to look into and look at his stories. But no, I didn't really look at other. But I do know that the church was present, and there are stories in a good source of all this is the Review and Herald from the 1945, 46, 47. It's all archived, and there's some really interesting stories. That's where I read the story about the Hiroshima. I don't know what happened at Nagasaki. I don't know if the Adventists were present there. No, I haven't found any stories about that.
So how much time did Francis spend in Japan then?
He was in Japan in the early 30s, and he left Japan for the States in he was actually put in a Japanese concentration camp in 39 before the war, and right before, I think in December of 41. I don't recall the exact date, but in December of 31, somewhere around there, they deported him to the States. Now this is part of family lore. This is what my Uncle Francis told me. Basically, they met him in New Orleans, where he met, and the Army said, "We understand that you are fluent in Japanese and you can read and write Japanese." Yes, that's correct. He wanted to learn Spanish, so when he was a young man in Loma Linda, he would just go hang around the rail yards where there were a large Hispanic population and just picked up Spanish. And so when he got to Japan, the first thing he did is learn Japanese, and he learned to write it, which is not an easy task. There's like 650 characters, or more. But they met him in New Orleans, and they said, "You have two choices. You can work with us to interpret, or you can go to jail." And Elder Francis said, "Well, I guess I'll be interpreting." Now, I know he couldn't, even back then when I was growing up, he couldn't really tell a lot, but his younger brother, my great uncle Alban, at one of the family reunions, told some of what he did. For example, he was translating some captured Japanese documents, and he couldn't understand it because it was all technical. So basically, they brought in an engineer, and they would sit line by line, and Uncle Francis would say, "Well, this could mean this or this." And the engineer would say, "Well, that second interpretation makes more sense technically." Okay, so they would. Then they'd read the next sentence. They'd go, "Well, it can mean this or this." And he said, "Well, based on the last sentence, and technically the second or the first one is the better interpretation." And they went through and they interpreted all these documents, and at the end they realized it was the Japanese atomic research documents. They were working on a nuclear bomb too. So he translated all of that.
Why was he in the concentration camp?
Because he was a Seventh-day Adventist. Well, and this will make another Vespers presentation because it's very interesting. But I'll tell you, the Japanese at the start of World War II, they basically outlawed Christianity, but they didn't want to they didn't outlaw it. They basically folded all Christian churches into the Shinto Christian Church, which was run by the Japanese government. And any churches that refused were essentially dissolved. And there were only, I think it was the Methodist Church refused, and the Seventh-day Adventist Church refused. The Seventh-day Adventist Church was able to continue to meet. Now, this was in this dissertation. It was very interesting. All the missionaries left. All the Western missionaries left, and the only people left in the Japanese church was the laity. Unfortunately, they hadn't really trained the Japanese laity on the tools, giving them the tools to run a church. So there was a lot of conflict as a result of that. They had a little bit of infighting, in arguing, and they elected people that weren't necessarily able to run a church. And one of the mistakes they did is they actually formed friendships with the Japanese agency that was in charge of churches. And they continued to operate based on their interaction with this agency. But because they didn't know really what to look for, when another agency came in and said, okay, that's it, we've had enough, dissolve the church, they were completely blindsided. They were completely taken by surprise. And one of the things that he mentioned in that this, I can't remember the person's name, who the doctoral student, one of the things he did mention is that this should be a lesson to the Seventh-day Adventist Church to watch diligently and watch for sudden changes and be ready for them. Because had the church been ready, they would have been a little bit more better prepared. As a result, at that time, there were 41 or 42 Japanese Seventh-day Adventists that were imprisoned. The death rate was four of them died in prison from malnutrition. Because the Seventh-day Adventist Church didn't acquiesce, when MacArthur's occupation forces came in, there was a Captain Beckett, I think it is, but there was a captain in the United States as part of the occupation forces that was a Seventh-day Adventist. And the first thing he did when he arrived is stop the sale of all the Seventh-day Adventist churches. Well, because the Seventh-day Adventist Church, all the other churches, their property had already been dissolved and taken in by the Japanese government. But because the Seventh-day Adventist Church didn't, their property was slated in 1945, like August 1945, to be sold. But because of that late date, Captain, I think Clark, or anyway, this captain was able to put a stop to all that sale and return all the land back to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And that was the first part of Francis Millard's mission when he arrived in Japan, was to start reestablishing. There was these the girls' school, the boys' school that had been taken over and used, the clinic, and all the churches that were still available. So they were able to get all this property back and restart the Seventh-day Adventist Church, whereas the other denominations didn't have that luxury because they acceded to the Japanese mission to dissolve them into this Shinto. And of course, that was MacArthur. The first act of MacArthur was to abolish the Japanese Shinto Christian and establish the. Basically, MacArthur wrote the new Japanese Constitution, and as part of the new Japanese Constitution was freedom of religion and freedom of speech. He put all that in there, and he was a big proponent of Christianity, not necessarily Seventh-day Adventist, but of Christianity in general for the Japanese people. And according to this dissertation, at that point, the Japanese people were very open to Christianity because of their loss of faith in the Shinto and Buddhists because the Shinto and Buddhist religions were heavily involved in the war effort, the Japanese war effort, and they were big on the propaganda. Well, when they lost the war, Japanese lost faith. Those religions fell out of favor. Unfortunately, there were some downturns and recessions after post-World War II that the Japanese associated with Christianity and Western churches. So their Christianity kind of fell out of favor in later years. So, and I don't know yet. I haven't gotten to the part yet with the current, or at least at the time of this article. I think his dissertation, I think, was in 70 or 80. And I don't know. I haven't gotten to the part about the current state of the Japanese church or the SDA church in Japan. I haven't gotten there yet.
I know it's one of the hardest countries for Christianity.
Yeah.
Japan is really hard to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a very difficult to. They're very resistant to change. Is one of the problems. So, all right. So that takes care of the Micronesia question.
You said that your uncle was given a choice to interpret or go to jail. What reason were they put him in jail? Was that just a threat to any
Just at the end, and you have to remember, this was World War II, and a lot of the protections that would have normally been in place weren't in place because of the war. That was the basis of the 150,000 Japanese Americans that were put into concentration camps and had their property and businesses confiscated. And now, in hindsight, we can look at it and say, no, that should never have happened. But because of the wartime and the concerns, and that was one of the problems that allowed Nelson and my uncle to become interpreters, because the government didn't really trust. We had a big body of Japanese Americans who were third generation, but because they were Japanese, the government didn't trust them to interpret and didn't trust them to do. And it's unfortunate, but back then the government was still very racist. That was one thing, and it turns out, now there were Japanese American army units that fought very bravely, but of course they fought in the European theater because they trusted them to fight in the European. They didn't trust them to fight in the Pacific theater because of their Japanese heritage.
A lot of the Japanese citizens that were here, they were put into camps, didn't they?
Well, that's what I say. Yeah, it was like 100 to 150,000. Now it was almost all West Coast. But yeah, there were camps out in the desert of Nevada, and where they moved them to, and they spent, I think, 3 or 4 years in the concentration camp. I call it a concentration camp. They were better. I mean, they were well fed. They did have schools. They did have store. It wasn't like they starved them like the Japanese and the Germans did. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Japanese, they were basically, like they couldn't just leave that place, but, and they had to, sometimes they have maybe not all the food they would want and such, like there were limitations, but they were kept alive, and they had a newspaper, like, it was way more favor.
Yeah, and they'd let them have schools.
No Auschwitz like that.
Yeah, no, yeah. So that, but it still wasn't right.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So, all right. That's all I have. Should we say a closing prayer, or you're going to take care? Okay.
Thank you so much.
Let me shut this